Welcome to OTR, Over the Rainbow, Achieving Mental Health for Real. This podcast offers hope to many people who needlessly suffer from mental health issues. Your host, Bob Adelman, brings you information on how you can recover from any mental health issue and achieve a happier life. Each episode interviews experts like doctors, counselors, and life artists who give helpful tips on living a happier life. But most importantly, Bob interviews ordinary people who have suffered with a mental health issue, some on the brink of or attempted to take their own lives. Each one has recovered to lead a much happier life. Most of the guests have books or websites with more info that you can use for recovery. You can do it too. If you want to know more, please check out his trailer. Bob's notes on today's show follows.
Kitt O'Malley is an author, public speaker, mental health advocate, and former psychotherapist who lives with bipolar disorder. Over the years, Kitt has struggled with bipolar, experiencing depression so deep that it was a living hell and mania so severe that she was psychotic. There is help. Psychotherapy, medication, and coping skills have enabled her to live a full life.
Now, here's Bob with today's show.
Kitt, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Welcome to the show. Would you like to tell us a little bit about you first?
Yes, sure, you bet. And thanks for having me on your show, Bob.
No problem.
I'm an author, mental health advocate, public speaker, and former psychotherapist who lives with bipolar. So that's the short intro. I'm also a mother and a wife, a mother of a now adult son.
And you said author, right?
An author, yes.
So what is your latest book?
My latest book is my one and only book. My book is my memoir, Balancing Act, Writing Through a Bipolar Life. It's for sale on Amazon. And in it, I share how I balanced living with bipolar with my work as a mental health advocate and caretaker of my son and parents. My book offers hope to those living with mental health conditions like bipolar and other mental health conditions, and offers hope to their loved ones. Basically the general public. It educates the general public. And then it tells about how my mental health journey has given me purpose.
Great. When you were growing up, when did you first notice that you might have some problems? Or was it later on?
When I was 18 years old, I was diagnosed with depression. I was severely depressed and suicidal. It went from ideation to me actually having the means, the method, the means to do it, a plan, a suicide note, all that kind of stuff. And then I realized, oh no, I'm actually going to do it this time. And I reached out and to a friend and to the resident assistant in the dorms where I lived at UCLA. And I said, I need to see a psychotherapist who's really good today. And the resident assistant got me in to see a psychologist at UCLA who practiced cognitive behavioral therapy. And that helped me rewrite those irrational thoughts like the world would be better off without me, to more rational thoughts like I've basically, the world is better off with me. I offer something to the world, and, my family would be better off without me. I'm loved by my family, things like that. So you would take those depressive thoughts and rewrite them into more positive, rational thoughts. And that helped me get through that crisis and taught me a skill in terms of how to stop thoughts like that and observe them and correct them. And basically it retrains your brain. So those shortcuts that go right to severe depression are sort of rerouted. Then I lived with the diagnosis of chronic depression, which is called dysthymia, throughout my 20s and 30s, even though at 30, I became so depressed that it was rather than it being a suicidal depression, it was a physical depression. I found myself unable to get out of bed. It was a year when I was 30 years old when my grandmother died, a friend from high school died, and I took a job working I was a psychotherapist at the time, and I worked with severely emotionally disturbed adolescents. And one of the adolescent boys, a 16-year-old, 6-foot boy, threatened to rape me during session. And I tried to get the phone. He disconnected the phone. And luckily, I was able to get out of the office and get help. But that was after that. I actually called my parents and I said, I can't do this anymore. And I can't get out of bed even, I can't get myself to get up out of bed. And they convinced me to go to my doctor for medication, which I did. I got up, got out of bed, went to my doctor, got medication. And the first medication I had was Prozac, which is an SSRI, and it gave me a very uncomfortable side effect where I felt like I was just about to jump out of my skin. And so then my doctor gave me trazodone, which is a more sedating antidepressant to counteract that side effect. And my parents thought, well, maybe, in conversations with my parents, they said, maybe you should get a second opinion from a psychiatrist. So I went to a psychiatrist, and unfortunately, the psychiatrist I went to rapidly changed my medication. He didn't believe in SSRI, so he took me off that. And then he had me just on the trazodone, which made me very, very sedating, so I slept all the time. Then he took me off the trazodone and put me on a tricyclic. And after that, after those rapid changes in antidepressants and with the tricyclic, I was triggered into a week of full-blown mania. And
Oh my God.
So I had 3 different streams of thought racing through my head. I had thoughts of a binary code, which is like a bunch of stream of zeros and ones. Of course, that made no sense to me. I knew it's just zeros and ones. I had a stream of thoughts about chaos theory, and I had a stream of thoughts about Christian mystic saints, which was something I actually had a particular interest in at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a friend who called my priest in my church and my father and said, Kitt needs your help now. And the priest came over and had me call the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist prescribed antipsychotics, which nipped at psychosis in the bud. Just for a 3-day period of antipsychotics, stopped it.
Wow.
And my father then came down, and then later my mother. And I tried to sort of put my life back together, but kept on. I really wasn't ready. My brain was just broken.
It sounds like an incredible voyage there. I know bipolar is extremely difficult when you get the super high highs, and then you go dip down into the lows. It's hard to control that, but. So you went on to try other medicines?
Yeah. So what happened was at that point in time, I found myself unable to drive because I would fall asleep driving, unable to read. I wasn't able to put words together to forms. When I tried to read, the words would fly apart. I couldn't put together words. I couldn't put together sentences, the words to make a sentence. My brain was not.
Were you still in the mania state when your brain stopped?
No, this was after the antipsychotics. I was still on the tricyclics, which I don't think were working. First of all, I don't think my brain had healed yet from the manic episode. It takes a while to recuperate. And then I was on a medication that was not ideal for me. What my parents and I decided is, although I was 30, almost 31 at that point, was that I would move back in with them because I could not safely drive. I took a temp job. I stopped being a psychotherapist, took a temp job. I couldn't safely drive because I was falling asleep, and I couldn't really do the job because I couldn't read. So I ended up moving in with my parents, seeing a different psychiatrist who worked in conjunction with a psychotherapist, and the psychiatrist believed that my mania was triggered by the medications, because before that I was high functioning.
Okay.
So they decided at that time, back in the early 90s, there was no differentiation between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that mental health providers use to diagnose mental illnesses. So I did not rise to although I did have that full-blown manic episode. Aside from that, before that, I did not have full-blown mania. And so he thought that it was what they call iatrogenic, which means it's caused, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it means it's caused by the medication. It was triggered by the medication. Mm-hmm. So he put me on another SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor,
right?
And had me go very slowly titrate up to a low dose that kept me stable. And anytime I would start having racing thoughts from the antidepressant, I would call, and then he'd slow down or reduce and slow down, the ramping up of the medication to a low dose.
So originally you were just depressed, but the medication actually caused you to slip into more of a mania state. Is that correct?
Correct. And so I was basically stable, or what would be considered stable. It wasn't full-blown mania. I was an overachiever who would periodically suffer depression. So I was treated for depression throughout my 30s with medication and psychotherapy until I was 39, when I was a mother of a toddler. And I started to feel euphoria and felt called to one church for Bible study and another church for spiritual direction. And although the behavior and what I was doing, going to Bible study and spiritual direction, was fine, there was nothing destructive about it, I recognized that euphoria, that feeling, as being symptomatic of hypomania or mania.
So then a doctor adjusted your medication for that?
Well, what happened at that point was I told my husband to get on the phone, and I called the advice nurse for my insurance, and I described what was going on. And she said, go to the ER or see a psychiatrist today, right now. And so it was a Friday afternoon. I wasn't able to get in to see a psychiatrist. I didn't want to go to the ER because that would mean probably I'd be hospitalized. But maybe not. I just didn't want to go to it.
Nobody wants to go there.
Yeah. Later I did go to an emergency room, when I wanted to be hospitalized. But this time I basically went to my regular physician. She gave me some mood stabilizers and said, you need to see somebody Monday, which I had an appointment to see a psychiatrist on the following Monday. And I took the mood stabilizers over the weekend before I had that appointment. And I was at that point diagnosed with bipolar disorder and have lived with bipolar disorder diagnosis.
And how old were you then? When you were
I was 39. I was 39.
So you lived with it for a long time without really knowing what it was.
And part of it's the progression of the illness, and part of it is the change in what clinicians diagnosed back when I was first treated with medication versus later on. There were more, even though in the literature there was an acknowledgement that there was literature showing, okay, this is a spectrum disorder. There's a bipolar 2 and there's a bipolar 3. The bipolar 2 is the one with the hypomania, which is a mild mania.
Right.
And the bipolar 3 is what we call cyclothymia, which is people who just have higher highs and lower lows than is within the normal range, but are still functional.
Right.
And I knew I was at least cyclothymic throughout my 30s. And I remember telling my health providers, I'm way more productive than most people. I'm probably cyclothymic, but I still wasn't diagnosed with bipolar until I had that euphoric feeling. And, because productivity and workaholism at that point in time wasn't considered diagnostic criteria enough to,
Well, when you first got diagnosed, there wasn't any bipolar.
Correct.
1 or 2, or was it bipolar at all?
They didn't have. They had it in the literature, but it wasn't in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It wasn't in the DSM yet when I was first diagnosed.
What year was this when you first got diagnosed?
Okay, when I had the full blown manic episode was 1993, I think, or 94.
But you were diagnosed with depression even earlier, right?
Right. I was diagnosed with depression in 1981.
Okay. All right. So it was a long period of time. In 81, it was like a night and day between now and 81. So they probably didn't know a lot about bipolar at that point.
It's sort of like, how much are you going to pathologize? I was a workaholic throughout my 20s and 30s.
When you were a child, did you have any idea that you were depressed, or you weren't?
No, not as a child. As a child, I was a super high achiever. I was like a type A. So, there's things you can look back and go, okay. There was one time I did some behavior where I was directing a one-act play in high school, and I got up on a desk and yelled at my cast, and I recasted the play like 1 week before. I was just very frustrated with my actors, and I fired and recast my lighting technician. I was a little.
So you were high strung then.
Creative. I was creative.
Through your childhood. Through your childhood. Yeah.
No,
but you weren't depressed.
Yeah, I was. I wasn't. I was extremely.
But you were very motivated.
Right. I was extremely high achieving, and then I also was a perfectionist. But then I lost my temper. Which wasn't typical behavior for me at all. But my drama teacher actually called my mom and said, "Kitt is yelling at her staff, at her cast right now." Like, it was definitely an instance of that's not okay behavior, But the play turned out great.
That's the bottom line. Doesn't matter how you feel, but the play is good. Do you think that your parents had any issues like this?
My parents. My father was an alcoholic, and my mom, I always thought of as an alcoholic, but later in life we realized she was basically drinking with him. So yes, she would get drunk too, but it was because it's like, if you can't beat them, join them. It was her way of coping.
Right. So you were kind of doomed from the start in a bit.
So there was that had a negative effect. And then my mom had, I don't know what she had, but some sort of undiagnosed mental illness. She had a tendency to attack people. And she had no insight into the effect that her emotionally attacked them, verbally. And people didn't, she had no insight into it. So it was pretty destructive.
Right. And back then people didn't, my parents had problems, but back then they didn't do anything about it. And I had a big problem for a long time, and they didn't do anything. My sister-in-law had to step in and say, this guy needs to go see a counselor.
Right.
Because I was doing all sorts of rituals, OCD, and it was a big problem, but they were not familiar with mental illness. It was just like not anything you talked about or anything you thought about.
Right.
And that's the thing that kind of lingers to this day, that it does have a big stigma to it. When you mention that you have mental illness, people get a little bit concerned about you. And that's the kind of thing on this broadcast that I'd like to prove wrong. Most people that have mental health issues are fine.
Right.
So this whole thing about you have a mental illness, so you're a problem. that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. And also to give people information. And you mentioned suicide. It's September is Suicide Awareness Month. And that's the big thing I'm looking at, is that people out there that are thinking about suicide, it's wrong. It's just wrong to your whole family. It's just wrong to everyone that loves you. And there's a lot of people that you don't even know love you.
Right.
And you gotta try, is what I say. Try. Because there's lots of help out there now. So that's part of what my whole spiel is.
Right. I totally agree with you, but I think that sometimes when you say it's wrong, which I understand what you're saying, it has a devastating impact on family and friends, but you're not thinking clearly when you're depressed. So I think what people have to know is that they are loved and that they have value, and that it's temporary, even though it feels like it's permanent. It is a temporary state, and that there is hope, that there's help out there, and there is hope, and that they're not alone. There are other people who have experienced what they're going through and who have, gotten help and survived and have thrived and have had a productive, wonderful life.
Well, I like to use myself as an example. I've had horrible issues with depression and major depression. And I'm sitting here today fully functional, not the happiest guy in the world, but, life is pretty good. And it wasn't before. It wasn't good. There was no good involved. It was all bad, everything. From the time I got up to the time I went to bed. For some reason, when you dream, you're not depressed. But I was so depressed and I had so much OCD, it was just ridiculous. And I came out of that without committing suicide, and I came out strong, I think. And I feel like I'm a lot stronger. I have a long way to go. I'm not the most healthy and mentally person in the world. I still have a lot of depression and anxiety. But I'm on the road to recovery. We all are.
And that's another thing for people to know, that even taking medications or being in treatment and going through and being in recovery doesn't mean that we are cured of our mental illness. It doesn't mean that we're symptom free. It means that we're living a for us, meaningful, productive life, and that we're taking care of ourselves. So we can still have symptoms and still have episodes. But recovery is an ongoing, non-linear, like it doesn't go, you have setbacks, but that still means you're still on the road to recovery as long as you are taking care of yourself, as long as you are working towards that.
Right. And it gives you the opportunity to be happy. Even if it's for an hour or a minute, you have happy moments, and that makes all the difference in the world. Because when you're really, really bad, it's just awful. And to be able to come out of it and be happy at times is a big victory. And I'm not finished. I mean, I'm gonna keep. I mean, there's all sorts of things coming out, like the therapy that has the psychedelics in it. I want to explore that, and there's all sorts of hope for new medicine and new cures for
there's
this.
Treatments there's improvements, So hopefully they'll keep on coming up with improvements and helping to help people out. So that to the extent that some of the mental health conditions can be debilitating, we really do need. And to the extent that some people aren't helped by treatments that are available, we need more research and work done to help those people out.
So your book goes over all of this that you went through in your life. What is in your book, other than what you already told us?
Well,
what kind of other things you have in there?
I start off with my journey And then I divide, and then after I talk about my journey in a narrative way, I go and I divide up my old my blog posts, which were, selected ones, which are short nonfiction about my, creative nonfiction about my experience, and poetry about my experience. And they're organized by the theme of bipolar disorder, basically the diagnosis and living with bipolar disorder, mental health advocacy, because that's what what my purpose is basically right now, is being a mental health advocate, and caretaking because I lived with bipolar, but at the same time I was taking care of a kid, my son, who's now 22. He had ADHD and severe migraines and depression and anxiety. So I had to take care of myself in order to take care of him. And then in the last few years of their lives, my parents both had dementia. And though they were in memory care, because there's no way I could have taken care of both of them, it was really challenging even in memory care because they were very independent.
Yes.
So I was a caretaker of my parents, in that I was the one who helped make the decisions along with my sister in terms of their treatment. I was the one who was local, so I was the one who visited and, coordinated care and made decisions. Of course, I had my sister's support, and she'd come down and visit, fly down when she could, and be there by phone and conference calls and stuff for, to make sure that our parents were well taken care of. But that was an extremely stressful time of both of our lives, because they both had dementia. My dad had alcohol-related dementia, and then my mom had been his caretaker until she had a stroke, and her stroke was devastating. It took away her ability to speak and understand language. Mm-hmm. And so that was really hard.
Dementia is you can't describe. It's so hard on a person when your loved one just kind of goes away and you don't know what to do, and it gets to be annoying, and it's, gets to be a real hardship.
Right.
Living with a person that has dementia.
So I didn't live with them, but I couldn't have. but for my mom, totally. I mean, I think that was very much kind of what led to her having a stroke, was just so much stress in her life, and having her blood pressure spike, and she had panic attacks and stuff because it was just so stressful for her. And finally, she had this just devastating stroke, and horrible. It damaged her brain so badly. It's just tragic. It was horrible to see.
I just think I think that anyone that has depression and anxiety has a tendency to make a lot of drama in their life. And one thing I look at is, what's worse than depression to people that are depressed? Boredom. If you're bored, you want to fill that, space, because you don't have the right chemicals flowing to your brain. So you might want to do some adrenaline. I used to do adrenaline when I worked. I was an adrenaline junkie, basically. So the one thing I like to point out to people is that some of your life probably could be changed. You don't need all that drama. You have to think about what you're doing and maybe change it around where it's not such a bad thing. And are you really just bored and looking for something to fill that void of people that are depressed? And so I think that's a big area that should be examined in a person's life. Yeah, I mean, I believe in that. I believe, like, people cut themselves. So why do they do that? Well, because they get in the moment if they cut themselves. They get adrenaline if they cut themselves. They don't have to be bored or sitting with depression and have nothing to do. If you make trouble for yourself, basically, you will produce chemicals like adrenaline, and that in a crazy way, that's better than boredom to a lot of people.
It's so basically the cutting and the adrenaline junkie stuff are, and forgive me, I was trained to be a psychotherapist, and I geek out on that. But both of those things are what would be considered negative coping mechanisms for the depression, and they are basically self-treatment, like negative self-treatment. Just like drugs and alcohol. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's like alcoholism. I was an adrenaline junkie.
Drugs and alcohol, adrenaline, and cutting, all of those are, so they're basically they're behavioral symptoms, and they're behavioral negative coping mechanisms. I used to self-harm myself when I was in high school, so I actually did have...
There you go. I mean, everybody does it now, it seems. I mean, I talk to children all around the world.
Yeah, I did it. I didn't cut. I picked at my skin, but I did it doing it.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah, I mean, I understand why people want to fill the void, but they have to examine, like, when they're bored, can they fill that up with constructive time? Things where they're doing something they enjoy that gives them natural, dopamine and stuff. And stop the trauma, because stopping the trauma and drama is I think very important when you're trying to recover. You have to realize that if you're sitting there and you say you're bored, a lot of times with me, if I get bored, I make something up. I make something in my head which generates frustration and anxiety, which generates chemicals in my brain. So it's like my brain is kind of lusting for these chemicals, and I have to sit there and say, wait a minute, I'm bored. Let me fill it up with something I like to do, like podcasting or whatever. Keep yourself busy if that's what you need to do.
Right.
Meditation is good, but sometimes meditation is too much into yourself. Sometimes. I mean, meditation is good if you know how to do it, but it's a little bit. For me, it was hard because I would get too into it and too bored, and it caused bad thoughts to come in my head. So you got to be careful with that. But I just think it's important that everyone realizes that on the road to recovery, you got to realize you got to stop drama in your life if you can, and just realize it. So maybe you can stop. Especially if you're cutting or anything. Right.
I think that's where
kind of addiction.
That's where a really good psychotherapist can help, is to, in terms of coming up with positive coping mechanisms. And peer support is incredibly helpful. There's a lot of peer support groups for those who have mental health issues, both online and in person. Now you can go to a lot of virtual peer support groups. And NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is one organization that offers peer support. There are others, and there probably are others that specify with anxiety disorders. OCD, they're thinking of it being something even different than an anxiety disorder nowadays. They used to think of it as anxiety, and now they're thinking of it as more of a neurologic issue. I think I might be remembering that wrong. But I geek out on reading research.
I just think that people have to realize that their brain is an organ and it can go bad, but that doesn't mean you're crazy or you're bad or anything like that. It means you need some help.
Exactly.
Either counseling, which stimulates the right chemicals if you go to counseling. And also, I had a person one time say to me, well, counseling, you're just talking. How could that make a difference? That's so wrong. It makes a big difference. I mean, that's like saying if somebody says something bad about you, you don't get your feelings hurt. It's the emotions that get generated that help you cope with the depression and anxiety.
I think it's interesting what you brought up, because I think that for different people, different types of therapy, or different treatment, or different peer support, like everybody, you need to find what works for you. Like like we're talking about, because
Right.
what works for me, and also I have bipolar disorder, which is this pretty serious mental illness, so medication is definitely, on the chart. But, and if you go to therapy and it doesn't help, it could be that therapist wasn't the right, a match for you. It could be that type of therapy wasn't the good match for you. So it's kind of, and even in medication, it's like you have to go through a lot of trial and error to get the right match, what works for you. So I think that for everybody, you have to say, don't give up, right? Keep trying, like you were saying, because there's something that will work for you, and just find that something that works for you in positive something.
Take it a day at a time. I mean, that's so important to stay in the moment. Because if you're in the moment, you can't be depressed. Because there is no past and no future. So that's important to keep in mind. Stay in the moment. If you have to, what I do is I feel things. It helps a lot. Like I have a bad thought, I try to change it. I start feeling the keyboard and the microphone and everything, and it takes me right out of it. So those types of things, yeah.
So it's sort of like it's like one of those exercises. It's the three exercises. Like you look at three things. I forget what it is, but there's like, you know what I mean? There are just very tangible exercises like that you can use that can get you out of that. And you're using mindfulness in terms of being in the moment. So that's working, that mindfulness is working for you, which is fabulous.
Do you have a social media that you'd like to plug? I'm going to put it on the description of the program. But is there a site?
For me, I have, for my personal site, it's kittomalley.com, KITTOMALLEY.com. For people who want general supportive information, I would recommend they go to NAMI, NAMI.org, O-R-G. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's the largest nonprofit in the United States that deals with mental health conditions. And it's a great resource in terms of information. There's lots of other stuff, too, out there. There are great things out there. But I'll just to be simple, I've got some resource links on my site, so you can go to resources and check out some major resources that are reputable. I don't go into a huge list. I just do, okay, here are the main ones.
And the name of the book again
Writing Through a Bipolar Life. And that's sold on Amazon. And you can get the link to it from my website as well.
Okay. That's great. You've been a great guest. I appreciate your story. I think it's important to get it out there. I'm glad you wrote the book. I'm glad you're getting better and you're recovering. Everybody that's listening that has these symptoms, they can get the book and find out how she got through them, and maybe that will pique something in you that makes it that much better. So I really appreciate you coming on. And thank you very much.
I had a wonderful time, and I wish you the best in your continued recovery. Yes. Oh, and NAMI's great for family members, too. I just wanted to say they have.
Okay. Maybe I'll check into that then.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.